a lonely woman takes in an abandoned child. And years later the father returns with something unexpected. For while the village slept, someone left a baby at Ruth's doorstep. The widow everyone had forgotten. The child abandoned in the rain with nothing but a basket and a small medallion. And Ruth did not hesitate, because where the world saw a burden, she saw a son. Naming him Tito and raising him with the little she had, enduring the scorn and whispers of the entire neighborhood. And for 12 years they survived with only the essentials: a roof, food, and a love that was enough. Until one day a man in fine clothes appeared in the village, not seeking business but the past. And when Ruth saw the resemblance between him and Tito, she knew the father had returned, though not with apology. Instead with an offer that would put a mother's love to the test and alter the fate of everyone forever. And time passed slowly. As though testing Ruth's patience, Tito was growing, and with him grew the sidelong glances and whispers from all directions. Not loud words, but murmurs that cut sharper than knives, wounding yet demanding the victim's silence. And the first to drift away were the village mothers, for when the children gathered in the yard to play ball or circle games, a sharp voice would soon call, "Come here, boy, don't mix with him." And sometimes they would not even use Tito's name, only waving him away like a stray dog that dared come too close. And Ruth pretended not to hear, though every time she saw Tito watching the game from afar, a lump rose in her throat, for he was still so little, perhaps not even understanding rejection. But the body feels what the heart cannot explain, and stories about him spread like smoke on the wind. That he had no father, no story, that such a child brought misfortune, some swearing that a boy found at dawn with a medal could only be tied to trouble. And the cruelest part was how these words reached Ruth's ears in the quietest moments of her day, washing at the creek, sweeping the yard, or setting the table, when loneliness screamed loudest because no one was there to share the weight. And though she could have explained, invented a tale, or claimed to know his real mother, instead she remained silent, a stubborn silence guarding what was precious. And rather than defending herself, she cared more, serving him extra beans, giving more meat when there was some, holding him longer when the day was heavy. For her love required no justification, and maybe that was why it was hardest for others to accept. And one afternoon when Ruth went to the store for salt and flour, the murmurs of conversation stopped as she entered, then resumed softer, yet loud enough to hear, whispering that perhaps she was raising him for gain, for people who take in others' children are never trusted. And her hands tightened on the bag until her knuckles whitened, yet she spoke not a word. And upon returning home she found Tito playing on the floor with a cannon stick, smiling at her, and that smile erased the sting of bitter voices. Though deep down Ruth knew the prejudice was not only against Tito but against her too. A widow without family who dared to love without permission, and to the village that was suspicious, for who gives without expecting, who plants without certainty of harvest. But she who had already felt the weight of being unseen knew that the worth of things lies not in reward but in the silence endured. And time taught Ruth to recognize the looks, pitying ones measuring her with thoughts of poor thing, she has no choice. Judgmental ones scanning Tito for traces of blood not hers, and empty ones pretending they did not exist, and she carried each look like scars, not to relive the pain but to remember she stood tall despite it. And on some nights, once Tito was asleep, she would stand at the doorway watching him, imagining the man he might become and praying he would grow without carrying the prejudice that settled over them like dust, holding the little medal, running her fingers over its cold surface and whispering, "Lord, may he never learn to hate." For prejudice was bitter, but hate was poison. And so, though reminded daily that Tito was not her blood, Ruth continued to love him as if he were. Because what the village never understood was that love does not need blood to be real. And with every meal, every washed shirt, every sleepless night, she declared, without words, that Tito was hers, not by blood, but the summer heat had stretched into the early days of the rainy season, bringing with it a heavy humidity that clung to the skin. One of those times when even the air seemed tired, and Tito was only 3 years old when the fever began. First, a face warmer than usual, then his whole body burning, eyes shining with heat, his sleep heavy and broken by shivers. And Ruth, accustomed to dealing with mild colds with teas and prayers, quickly realized this wasn't normal, so she took his small, sweaty, weak hand and felt the burning heat against her palm. And with no husband to run for help, no family to knock on the door, she slipped on her worn-out sandals and left, late afternoon with the sky already heavy with storm clouds, going first to the home of one of the older women in the village, a former midwife, knocking, calling, waiting until the woman appeared at the door, her gaze cold, asking, "Is he your son?" As if the answer were a pass to enter. But when she heard, "Not by blood, but I raise him," her face hardened and she said she had nothing to give. And though Ruth tried to explain, the door was already shut, so she went on to another house asking for eucalyptus leaves, anything to ease the fever. But all she received was a dismissive gesture, a sideways glance, and the same sentence repeated like a curse: "He's not your son, not your problem." Each refusal weighing on her shoulders like a whetstone as the wind carried the scent of damp earth, announcing that a storm was coming. But the greatest storm had already settled inside her, and back at home she found Tito murmuring nonsense, delirious. So she sat beside him and placed a damp cloth on his forehead. The hours dragging on while the sound of rain on the roof became the soundtrack of her vigil, and with no medicine, no help, no company, Ruth improvised everything she knew, praying the words her mother had taught her, whispering stories as if her voice alone could tether the boy to the world of the living. And midnight came with thunder as she knelt on the hard-packed floor, refusing to leave his side, singing an old lullaby, the kind half-cradle song, half prayer, "Sleep, little one. The angel is near," as though in the rhythm of that melody she was trying to convince life itself not to leave, while the oil lamp lit the sweat on the boy's forehead, and the reflection of the little medal hanging in the window seemed to sway in sync with her heartbeat. And by the second night her body was exhausted, but her eyes would not close as she made an infusion with the few leaves she had, fed him spoon by spoon, careful not to spill, replaced cold cloths, changed the sweat-soaked sheet, held his hand, as sleep came in broken waves, while outside no one knocked, no one asked if they needed anything. The village, always so quick to gossip, keeping quiet in the face of the illness of a child they said had no rightful name, and only on the third night did the fever begin to break. Tito breathing more calmly, his face less flushed, and Ruth leaned her forehead against his, feeling relief spread through her like the warmth of a campfire, smiling to herself, a tired smile but whole, looking up at the ceiling and whispering, "Thank you, Lord," with no audience for that moment, no witnesses to her silent victory. And the next morning she opened the door to the timid son returning after the rain, washing the cloths, sweeping the house, making a thin broth for Tito, to regain his strength, watching him eat slowly, holding the spoon clumsily, knowing all the exhaustion had been worth it, for the world might not consider that boy hers. But Ruth knew she had fought the fever the way only a mother would, and so between abandonment and care, between rejection and persistence, another invisible root grew between them, and it didn't matter what people said. No one could ever again say Tito was alone, for as long as Ruth had breath to sing and hands to care, he would have shelter. And that afternoon the sun was setting lazily, casting a yellow light over the hard-packed earth of the yard, while Tito, with his skinny knees and bare feet, was running after a piece of wood he pretended was a toy car, his laughter slicing through the air light as if for a few moments he had forgotten the world that looked at him sideways. And Ruth sat on the doorstep mending a worn-out shirt, watching each step, each stumble, like someone guarding the rarest treasure they have, until during one of those careless spins the inevitable happened. Tito tripped over a root and fell to his knees, dragging his thin skin against the rough ground, the crying coming quickly, hot and honest, more from fright than pain. But in the middle of those childish sobs a word escaped, almost shouted, "Mom, help me," and the needle stopped mid-air, time seeming to take a step back. For Mom, it was the first time she had heard that word, and it hadn't come out as play or imitation. It came loaded with need, with absolute trust, and Ruth stood up, her legs trembling not from effort but from the sweet weight of that word, as she walked over, knelt down, and saw the thin blood trickling down his knee. And she didn't respond right away, didn't say, "That's me," or "You're right," but simply picked him up gently and carried him inside. And at the stove she warmed some water while Tito still cried, his breathing broken, whispering, "We're going to wash this with warm water," her voice low, almost to herself. And she cleaned the wound slowly, blew on it to soothe the sting, then wrapped it with a clean cloth, tying it tightly, while inside her heart danced to a rhythm it hadn't known in years, because that word, so short and yet so huge, had pierced through time and absence, as if the boy had unknowingly opened a door she thought was locked forever. For since her husband had gone and her family had scattered, no one had called her mom in that direct way, and now this word came from a small mouth she loved without obligation, cared for with no promise of return, and no one in the village needed to know, for life had already taught her that the most sacred words are best kept secret, because the world ruins what it doesn't understand. So Ruth let that moment stay between the two of them, like a jewel kept in the back of a drawer, and she went on with the day as usual, served food, swept the kitchen, hung laundry on the line. But every time her eyes landed on Tito a quiet flame lit in her chest, and the days that followed carried the same simplicity as Tito went back to playing, and the wound healed, leaving just a thin line on the skin. But for Ruth that scratch carried more than a scar. It was the mark of the moment he had recognized her, not for what the world said but for what he felt, something no document could prove and no rumor could erase. And that night, lying down on her mat with sleep slow to come, she kept replaying the sound of the word mom from his mouth, repeating it in her mind like someone trying not to forget a tune. And maybe it was too soon for him to understand the weight of that choice. Maybe he wouldn't even remember later, but for Ruth it was a silent vow that in moments of pain and fear it would be her he'd call, while the little metal in the window swayed with the weak wind and the oil lamp made it glimmer like a tired but steady star. And Ruth, watching it, understood she didn't need a seal, stamp, or certificate to belong in that place. She just had to be present. She just had to stay. And staying was something she knew how to do like few others. So through a boy's stumble, a bond was born, stronger than ever. A bond not dependent on blood but on devotion. And even if no one in the village had heard it, Ruth knew that one word spoken only once had already grown roots strong enough to last a lifetime. And as the school year began with new movement in the village, children running along trails, mothers adjusting clothes with safety pins, and fathers chatting at the general store, the news spread quickly that a teacher from the city would arrive. Rebecca Young, educated, neatly dressed, carrying a leather briefcase and a list of demands. And while to the village she seemed a sign of progress, to Ruth she meant yet another closed door. For at the first meeting under the school's simple roof, Rebecca spoke firmly, listing her requirements and insisting that every student must have a birth certificate. No document, no enrollment. Words sharp as a knife. And while some mothers whispered and others nodded, to Ruth it sounded like a sentence. Because she didn't have Tito's certificate, didn't even know where he was born, and walking home, with the boy holding a stick like a sword and asking if he too would go to school. She only smiled in silence while inside her memories raged of the night she found him in the rain, the cold metal pressed to his chest, the gossip that never died on, the fear that the world would once more deny him his place. So that night while he slept, she stared at the metal swaying and whispered a prayer for light. And the next morning, instead of going to the fields, she dressed in her neatest clothes, tied a scarf around her head, slung a cloth bag over her shoulder, and walked the long dirt road to the county seat. More than 2 hours through hills, creeks, and dust beneath a relentless sun. And at the registry office she climbed the stairs, felt the eyes of strangers on her, but calmly explained to the clerk she needed a temporary document to enroll the boy, answering with approximate dates, her own last name, and the firm declaration, if the world won't give him a name, I'll give him mine. And she walked out with a simple paper that to her weighed like gold, folded carefully into her pocket, and though her body was tired, her heart was light. Because now Tito had the right to sit among the others, to learn, to read, to write, to belong. And on enrollment day, Rebecca inspected the document, looked at Ruth, maybe understanding the cost, maybe not, but signed it without question, while Tito smiled, unaware of the storm that had been fought for him. And as they left, some mothers whispered, she did everything just to get that boy into school, in tones both judging and admiring, but Ruth only squeezed his hand and told him, now your name's on the list, and no one can take it away, though she knew the village would still watch and gossip, ready to judge. Yet for that day she had won a battle, as always, quietly, without seeking recognition, only with the silent strength of persistence. And time moved forward, steady but unhurried, as Tito grew, no longer the boy, with scraped knees, but at 12 his shoulders broadening. The dirt road stirred up dust beneath the hooves of horses and the creaking wheels of an elegant carriage, and at the front a man in fine clothing. Edward stepped down, adjusting his hat and tailored coat, garments no one in that village had ever worn, his stride confident, his gaze alert like someone searching for something they weren't sure they truly wanted to find. And the village, curious as always, paused to watch. Children crowding along the roadside, women peeking from behind doors, while men pretended to keep working though their eyes followed the visitors' every step. And Edward passed the well, where Tito was busy helping fill buckets for the neighbors. And when their eyes met, something uncanny happened, for the stranger stopped, staring at the boy as if the entire world had vanished, his face draining of color, and for a moment it looked as though he would speak, but he swallowed the words, and Tito, puzzled, looked away and continued filling the buckets. Though when Edward crossed paths with him again on his return from the store, that same piercing gaze returned, and this time there was no doubt he had seen something he could not ignore. And by nightfall Ruth was in the kitchen preparing dinner when firm knocks echoed at the door, and opening it she came face to face with Edward, who removed his hat to reveal hair already streaked with time, and asked to come inside. His expression not of a man seeking business or directions, but heavy with memories and something Ruth could not quite name, perhaps guilt, perhaps regret. And they sat at the simple table, the oil lamp casting wavering shadows on the walls after a silence that dragged too long. And he asked about the boy, to which Ruth answered that Tito was in the backyard, and Edward drew a deep breath like one bracing to cross a treacherous river and said, I saw that boy today, and I need to know how he ended up here. And Ruth did not answer at once, but instead studied him, weighing his intentions. For years of wary looks from the village had taught her that not every question came from a place of kindness. But the tremor in his voice, the restless twitch of his hands on the table, revealed that this conversation was unlike the rest. And Edward pressed on. He has a way about him, a look in his eyes, just like someone I once knew, someone I left behind. And his eyes, now shimmering with tears, betrayed the burden of a story far from light. And from the yard Tito stepped inside, drawn by voices, and Edward turned toward him, momentarily struck dumb, for the boy's expression, the lines of his face, the furrow of his brow, all mirrored something he knew too well. something he had perhaps spent years trying to bury, and the silence that followed grew thick until the visitor lowered his eyes, breathed deeply, and abruptly said goodbye, promising he would return, and Ruth watched him leave, sensing this encounter would not be the last. For the way he had looked at Tito carried something heavy, something true, teetering on the edge of revelation, and that night Ruth lay long awake, Edward's face etched in her thoughts alongside the cold gleam of the metal swaying in the window, certain that Tito's past was about to knock, and when it did, life would never be the same. And dawn broke grey the next morning with a wind carrying the scent of damp earth as Ruth was in the yard chopping wood when steady footsteps approached along the trail, and looking up she saw Edward once more, slower this time but determined, as if resolved on what he must say. And upon reaching her he removed his hat and asked to talk, his voice deep, hesitant, as though each word bore great weight. And inside the kitchen he lingered standing, glancing about as though seeking courage among the humble objects, before finally sitting at the table, both hands pressed to the wood, and letting fall the words without ceremony, "That boy, he's my son." And the silence hung dense, Ruth remaining upright, dish towel in hand, struggling to absorb the enormity of it, and Edward